And at this point, I want to refer listeners, again, to an article by Edward Lipinski. It's called El's Abode, subtitle, Mythological Traditions Related to Mount Hermon. It's from the journal Orientalia Lovaniense Periodica. It's published in Belgium. Because the article is about where does El live? Okay, El, Ugaritic El, who was the head, he was the one who fathered all the other gods. He's the highest authority, the high sovereign. Even though Baal, who is his co-regent, gets called the Most High and all that stuff in Ugaritic religion, he still has to get permission from El to do things. And we know in the Hebrew Bible that Yahweh, the God of Israel, gets described with both El epithets and Baal epithets, and that's because the biblical writers want to elevate Yahweh above El and Baal. Both, Ugarit was their next door neighbor. Of course, religiously, Baal had a big influence. El worship had a big influence on the Israelites, and so the prophets will use this material to say, no, Yahweh, Yahweh and this other guy El, there are two different things here. You need to worship Yahweh and Him alone, and all that stuff. Okay. All of that said, there was a lot of speculation, both in ancient times and in scholarship, about, okay, Ugaritic texts talk about El's abode and El's council, where it meets, and all this stuff. Now, we get a description of Baal's. Baal's council is in Safon, okay, the remote north. But what about El's? Now, up until Lipinski's article, most scholars would have put this location, where is El's mountain, at a place called Afka, Mount Afka, near Kirbet Afka. It's a mountain that's between Byblos and Baalbek. But there's again a well-known place here between Byblos and Baalbek that most scholars thought, okay, this was what the ancients thought was the mountain of El, the dwelling place of El. Lipinski points out, though, that, there isn't a single Ugaritic text that names this as the place of El and his council. And besides that, Afka is just a common noun. It's never used as a proper noun. It says this: it locates this place 1,000 fields and 10,000 acres distant from Mount Safanu, which was Baal's mountain. So you get sort of a vague description. This is where El's house is. 1,000 fields, 10,000 acres distant from Mount Safanu. So Lipinski seizes on this and says, okay, let's try a few locations out, and let's look in the Ugaritic texts for maybe some vocabulary that we can figure out where this would have been. He is convinced that the mountain of El for the Ugaritic people, again, would have been in ancient Armenia, but for the biblical people, for the Israelites, okay, what they associated the Ugaritic stuff of where El lived, they believed it was Mount Hermon. Lipinski, he makes this comment. He says, there's an old Babylonian version of the Gilgamesh epic that identifies Hermon and Lebanon with the dwelling of the Anunnaki. Now, the Anunnaki, again, in early Mesopotamian religion, were gods. They were members of the divine council. In later Mesopotamian religion, later texts, they get consigned to the abyss. They become like the lords of hell, okay, if you want to say it that way. But in the old Babylonian text, the story of Gilgamesh, they're just part of the divine council, and the place where they meet is Hermon and Lebanon. The Ugaritic term for Hermon is Sharyan. That is very, 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 very close to Sirion in Deuteronomy 3:9, Psalm 29:6, and 1 Enoch 13, verse 9. He's suggesting, again, that Mount Hermon was, to these ancients, the dwelling place of the divine council. This is where they met. And it's specifically actually linked to the Anunnaki in this old Babylonian version of Gilgamesh. I'll even read it to you. If you have Pritchard's Ancient Near Eastern Texts of the Old Testament, the 3rd edition, this is pages 504 and 505. Again, this is the old Babylonian fragment of the Gilgamesh epic. Gilgamesh is talking to Enkidu. And they're in the forest, okay, and they have to confront this monster, Huwawa. It says, Gilgamesh heeded what his friend said. He took the axe in his hand. He drew the sword from his belt, and Gilgamesh struck him, Huwawa, in the neck. This is the guardian monster of the forest. And so they kill Huwawa. He struck the watchman, Huwawa, to the ground. For 2 leagues the cedars resounded. Enkidu killed him with him. And then there's a reference to the forest cedars. Then Enkidu killed the watchman of the forest, with him, and at whose word Sarya, which is the Akkadian word for the Ugaritic term Sharyan and the Hebrew term Sirion, at whose word Sarya, in other words Hermon, Mount Hermon and Lebanon, trembled. All the mountains became, and all the hills became, text is broken. He slew the gap, and then there's a reference to the cedars. Then it says here, they pressed on into the forest, and he opened up the secret dwelling of the Anunnaki. Gilgamesh is there cutting down trees, and the forest is referred to as the secret dwelling of the Anunnaki. Lipinski's article demonstrates that these terms that you run across in these ancient texts, Sharyan, Sirion, a reference to a cedar forest, a cedar mountain, again, they point to Mount Hermon as being the dwelling place of El's council. And it makes sense, because that's where you have a cedar forest. And not only that, Lipinski goes on for 2 or 3 pages talking about how well-watered it is geographically. El's abode in Ugaritic text described as a well-watered garden. Okay, you have the watering motif there, you have the garden motif, you've got the cedars, you've got all this stuff. So, again, why the connection with Eden? Because Eden was the cosmic mountain. It was the dwelling place of Yahweh. It was the place where the divine council met to listen to Yahweh and figure out, hey, what's on the task list for today? It's where humans are created to be part of the council, and then to overspread the earth and make the rest of the earth like Eden. This is why Eden can be talked about as a garden and as a mountain. It's where God lives, and where God lives, that's where he does business. And where he does business, the council is. Okay, there are references in the Psalms. Psalm 42, 6 and 7. Catch the language here. The psalmist says, "My soul is cast down within me. Therefore I remember you from the land of Jordan and from Hermon, from Mount Mizar. Deep calls to deep at the roar of your waterfalls. All your breakers and your waves have gone over me." Again, Hermon, well-watered, it's a forest. But I want to take you back to Amar Anas's article, because he actually discusses a number of these themes, and I'll read you a couple of things from Lipinski as well. And just listen to how this language about Hermon and Lebanon makes sense in the context of the divine council. We'll start with Lipinski here. On page 40, he says, according to the Midrash Rabbah on Genesis 33, the cavern of Pan, the cavern of Banyas, which of course is on Mount Hermon, was one of the outlets of the deep or the ocean from which came the waters of the flood. A rabbinical tradition identified this with the source of the Jordan, with one of the fountains of the great deep, from Genesis 7, 11, and 8:2. In accordance with ancient cosmographical ideas, the outburst of water from the cavern of Banyas, this is Mount Hermon, has thus been conceived as an eruption of the subterranean ocean on which the earth was believed to rest. On the other hand, the Testament of Levi 2, verse 7, that's a pseudepigraphical text, locates above Mount Hermon a great sea hanging there, which is a celestial ocean. Again, remember in the Hebrew Bible, God dwells above the firmament, above the waters above the firmament. Page 41. The passage, Psalm 42 and others, and in the Ugaritic text that have 2 oceans, the double deep, deep calls to deep, the Tehom calling to the Tehom. These passages have the subterranean source of the fountains, springs, and rivers that come out of the earth, and the celestial reservoir from whence comes the rain. They join in the region of the upper Jordan and of the, quote, giant Mount Hermon, whose summit was supposed to reach up to the first heaven. The 2 oceans are personified and represented as calling aloud to one another through the Tsinorim, through the water tunnels, in 2 Samuel 5:8. And they are connected inside the mountain, and they burst out from the cave of Banyas. This could suggest to localize El's abode in the midst of Mount Hermon, since he was supposed to live at the sources of the rivers, the midst of the springs of the two deeps, the double deep. Anas says this: there are more reminiscences of the Mesopotamian origin in other versions of the angelic descent myth. Now we're talking about the Watchers. That the Watchers descended to Earth with a good intent is in background also in the Aramaic fragment 4Q530, which belongs to the Book of the Giants. Again, some of the Dead Sea Scroll texts, some of the portions of Enoch disagree over whether their intent was good or not. But he says, in this text, in this Aramaic fragment, it contains in a broken context the reference to the Watchers as gardeners at work, nurturing and protecting the trees, which connects the Watchers prior to their apostasy. You know, what they were doing. They were the gods. They were the sons of God. They were these divine beings there to help take care of Eden, take care of the divine abode. This reference to gardeners is to be compared to Jubilees 5:6, where God sent the angels to earth, and further specifies the reason, in order to instruct human beings and to act with justice and righteousness upon the earth. But of course they go corrupt. According to Jubilees, only after the Watchers' arrival and sojourn among human beings were they corrupted and led astray by the irresistible beauty of mortal women. The statement in the Qumran fragment that the gardeners were watering may be an allusion to the initial good work, the good mission of the Watchers. But then they go corrupt. On another page, 304 Anas, he says, in an old Babylonian fragment, so he's talking about the same one Lipinski is, an old Babylonian fragment of the Gilgamesh epic, the Cedar Mountain is identified as Hermon and Lebanon. An interesting coincidence of identity. The association of the Watchers' sons with a cedar forest in the Damascus document from Qumran says that they were tall as cedar trees, and they had bodies like mountains. And this is a Dead Sea Scroll. Another one. The account of the flood, this is Anas 309-310. The account of the flood and its results in the Era epic again invites a comparison with Jewish lore about the Watchers and the Giants. In the Qumran fragment 4Q530, which mentions the Watchers as gardeners, there's also a reference to destructive water and fire, abruptly doing away with all the flourishing vegetation in the garden under the Watchers' care. The gardeners in this symbolic dream refers to the Watchers, and the trees to the Giants. Another Qumran fragment, which is probably a textual witness to the same dream, mentions a garden and a tree with 3 shoots, which apparently survives the flood. The image serves as a symbol for the preservation of Noah and his 3 sons. This narrative refers to the Watchers' original mission as culture bringers. Remember that phrase of the Apkallu? The Watchers, who were the original culture bringers, had turned to evil, and the final result was their destruction by the flood. These ideas describe a primeval forest, okay, that is the dwelling place of God. Just like in other texts, the language of a garden is used, or the language of a mountain is used. Here we have the primeval forest of the divine council, the well-watered garden abode, the mountain abode of God, also known as Eden, also known as the cosmic mountain. Hermon and the forests right next to Hermon are easy matches for all of these things. We have Ezekiel 28, references Eden as a garden and a mountain, and we have a divine rebellion in there. That's the point of the analogy. We have Isaiah 14, which shares language from Ezekiel 28, that the divine rebel gets sent to the abyss, gets cast down to Sheol, cast down to Eretz, the earth, which is another word for Sheol. Ezekiel 28, Ezekiel 31, Isaiah 14, and Genesis 3 utilize the same metaphors, the same point of analogy of a divine rebel, not the man, not Adam. And so what we have in Ezekiel 31 is, yet again, another reference to a rebellion in the divine council that is used, in this case, to say, look, Egypt, you think you're great, but nations and their gods who are greater than you have fallen. And to reinforce that point, I'm going to draw on the story of a wonderful being in a wonderful place, right there with his comrades in the divine council on Hermon. Okay, right there. And they were judged. As mighty as these gods, these divine beings were, they're better than humans. Okay, as mighty as they were, when rebellion against the will of God, the Most High God, when rebellion against Him happens, it will be dealt with. So take heed, because you're nothing special. You're going to be judged. It's going to be terminated. You're going to be history.